Let's talk about how it happened, how the investigation unfolded, and about different aspects of the story of the Twin Towers. Flight 11 of American Airlines departed Boston for Los Angeles, a plane with a large fuel load. All the other flights hijacked that day were similarly long-haul routes, because the hijackers needed a huge amount of jet fuel on board that could ignite after impact with the target. The Boston flight took off, and within minutes was seized by terrorists. I won't list every hijacker. There were 4 teams of 5 people each. One man was detained by police beforehand for a visa violation and did not take part in the attack. That left 19 hijackers. The leader of the first team was a man named Mohammed Atta, 33 years old. He had learned to pilot aircraft, and that group of 5 entered Boston's airport. The security system selected certain people for secondary screening, and Atta was among those checked. Something about his luggage looked suspicious, so it was scanned, yet ultimately everyone was allowed to board. By mistake, Atta's luggage was not loaded onto the flight. Flight 11 took off. The hijackers, armed with small knives, and by some accounts, pepper spray cans, took control, killed the pilots, and Mohammed Atta took the controls. Why did they seize the aircraft so quickly? At that time, cockpit doors were not reinforced. There was no procedure that one pilot would lock the door from inside while the other went to the lavatory. Those procedures were introduced only after 9/11. All the hijackers sat in business class, then stood up, subdued a flight attendant, forced their way into the cockpit, killed the pilots, and began to fly the plane. The captain, John Ogonowski, was a former military pilot who had flown in Vietnam. He was murdered. A fact that may seem incidental but is fateful. Seth MacFarlane and actor Mark Wahlberg were scheduled on that flight, but canceled and flew to Los Angeles on a different aircraft. They were spared that day. The controllers noticed the aircraft was flying unusually, performing maneuvers not characteristic of a civilian airliner. New York Air Traffic Control realized something strange was happening and contacted the military. At 8:37, 2 F-15s were scrambled to intercept that Boeing, 7 minutes after it had already struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Experts later estimated the plane's speed on impact at 784 km/h. The Boeing hit the North Tower at full speed. The flight recorders were never recovered, and a massive, unimaginable fire erupted inside the tower. At that moment, many still thought it was an accident. The second plane also departed Boston for Los Angeles and was also carrying a huge load of jet fuel. There were 5 hijackers on board. None of them were selected by the random screening system, that computer system that flags suspicious passengers for additional checks, so nobody was rescreened in this case. After takeoff, the terrorists seized the aircraft, killed the pilots, and Marwan al-Sheikhi, leader of that cell, took over the cockpit. The aircraft nearly collided in midair with another plane, a Delta Airlines flight from Hartford to Tampa. It could also have struck a Midwest Airlines flight from Milwaukee to New York. Passengers managed to make calls and report the hijacking. They could see what was happening in the cabin and realized the plane was heading toward downtown New York and the towers. At 9:03, this flight struck the South Tower at an angle. The jet had rotated slightly on impact. About 900 people in that tower died, and all passengers on the aircraft were killed. Just as on the first plane, none of the passengers survived. Realization that it was an attack. Only then did the realization come. This was an act of terror. Until the second tower was hit, broadcasters primarily showed smoke rising from the Twin Towers. The fire at the North Tower looked like a terrible accident. Then, live on air, the second plane hit the South Tower. Rescue services began to operate immediately. Firefighters mobilized, but evacuations from the upper floors were impossible. Metal began to melt. Structural elements failed. Stairs collapsed. Elevators were inoperable. In the North Tower, many stairwells were blocked. In the South Tower, only one stairwell remained passable, and people used it to descend. Those who did not go down tried to get to the roof to be rescued by helicopter, but roof exits were locked, and the huge plumes of black smoke rising above the two towers made helicopter rescues impossible. Contrary to the popular narrative that no one knew between the first and second hit, the US government already had intelligence. When the pilots of the first plane were murdered and Mohammed Atta took the controls, he made an announcement to passengers saying the plane had been hijacked, that they were heading to an airport, that there was a bomb on board, and that if everyone remained calm, everything would be fine. He recorded the message but pressed the wrong button, and it went to the air traffic control tape, not the cabin. Controllers thus knew it was a hijacking, and by the third takeoff, military and controllers already understood what was happening. Air traffic control started warning all US airlines that two planes had been hijacked and to be vigilant. And indeed, the pattern repeated. The third plane. The next flight took off from Washington, American Airlines Flight 77. 4 hijackers were aboard. The team leader was a trained pilot who had attempted to fly for a Saudi airline in the mid-1990s and had flying experience. He and his team were screened, but not removed from the flight. They seized control, killed the pilots, and flew the aircraft toward their chosen target, the Pentagon. At 09:35, that hijacked aircraft struck the Pentagon in Washington. Among the passengers aboard was Barbara Olson, a well-known television host and former lawyer, who called her husband twice, first to report the hijacking and then to ask what she should tell the captain. In every attack, the hijackers used the same method. Passengers were forced to the rear of the cabin and held under the control of the terrorist team, while 1 or 2 hijackers remained in the cockpit to fly the plane. Resistance on the fourth plane. The fourth hijacking involved United Airlines Flight 93, which departed Newark for San Francisco, also a long flight with a heavy fuel load. The seizure began in the same way. Pilots killed, cockpit taken. But on this flight, the passengers had already heard about the two towers and the Pentagon on the news and realized the hijacked planes were being used as weapons. There were roughly 35 phone calls from Flight 93. Some of the recordings are publicly available. You can hear people who understand they are about to die. The passengers organized resistance. Flight 93 is the only one of the 4 planes from which the flight recorders were recovered. Therefore, we know with certainty what happened in the cabin. The passengers stormed the cockpit to retake control. The last words of passenger Todd Beamer, who led the revolt, were, "Are you guys ready? Let's roll." Those 2 phrases later became an emblematic slogan of the anti-terror struggle. The cockpit crew evidently, whether voluntarily or forcibly, directed the plane down. At 10:03, about 2 kilometers from Shanksville, Flight 93 crashed into the ground at approximately 906 km/h. All aboard perished. The South Tower collapsed at 09:59, the North Tower at 10:28, and by evening, another WTC building, 7 World Trade Center, a skyscraper nearby, also collapsed under the weight of debris, dust, and fire. It fell at 17:20. I deliberately avoid repeatedly showing footage of the burning towers in this narration. You can find the images on the internet. Many people on the upper floors were cut off. Those trying to evacuate were buried under rubble, and many firefighters who rushed in were themselves killed under the wreckage. But it is important to tell how the media behaved, how the media profited from blood traffic. For media outlets, a catastrophe is a ratings windfall. In the US, the central visual narrative of the tower's disaster became the images of people falling. Those who could not escape jumped from windows. Their falls were caught on camera. The most famous photograph, The Falling Man by Richard Drew, became the day's emblematic image. It was shown widely that day, and the next, then it disappeared from publication. An article in Esquire, which I will link in the description, tells the story of that photo. Over time, many readers protested to newsrooms. "Stop showing the falling people. We don't want to look." The images gradually disappeared from newspapers and TV. Perhaps the first time in history, the public forced media to moderate coverage. There was a fierce debate about freedom of the press, but public pressure won. Separate from that, the heroism of American firefighters. Men who rushed in to clear rubble and pull survivors out. Even those who were on vacation returned at their own expense to help. 341 firefighters died in the attacks. New York firefighters became national heroes. In total, 2,177 people died in the attacks, including aircrew and all aircraft passengers. It remains the deadliest terrorist attack in American history. The mayor of New York, Rudy Giuliani, famously said, "Near tears, we have seen things we have never seen before." The skies were shut down immediately. Commercial flights were grounded at the request of national security authorities. International flights bound for the U.S. were diverted to Canada and Mexico. Most major cities were patrolled by Air Force and National Guard units. The country was at an unprecedented terrorism alert level. Cultural losses and the victims. Many major corporations had offices in the towers. That morning, many people who worked in those buildings simply never went to work. A man named Sasha missed a lecture at Chase Manhattan Bank and thereby avoided being there. But many did not. Offices there contained priceless artworks, sculptures by Rodin, paintings by Miro and Roy Lichtenstein, 40 negatives from John F. Kennedy's personal archive. Countless cultural treasures were lost. The windows on the World Restaurant, typically packed with guests in the morning, became a place from which people could not escape. The human and cultural loss was huge. Richard Drew, the photographer of The Falling Man, had a history of capturing historic moments. His first famous photograph, taken at age 21, captured the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. That day, he had been assigned to photograph a maternity fashion show. He was redirected and captured the disaster. Later, he produced another indelible image. How the terrorists were identified. Investigators learned the names of the attackers, in part thanks to Atta's luggage. Since his bag had not been loaded onto Flight 11, when it was opened, the investigators found documents listing all 19 participants. By evening, the FBI knew their identities, origins, and the financial trail. Who held which U.S. bank accounts? The investigation was unprecedented. Most of the hijackers were young men in their 20s and early 30s. Many were well-educated and came from reasonably comfortable backgrounds, not the impoverished, poorly educated suicide bomber stereotype. This was the first time we confronted operatives who trained for piloting and dedicated themselves ideologically to martyrdom. The FBI estimated that Al-Qaeda spent between $400,000 and $500,000 preparing the operation, a substantial sum. Several of the Atta cell had already been on the FBI's radar. I will later note why they weren't arrested. Those men were members of Al-Qaeda. Initially, Osama bin Laden denied involvement. On September 16th, an Al Jazeera broadcast carried a message denying Al-Qaeda's involvement. On September 28th, another tape again denied responsibility. Only in November, when a videotape surfaced in Jalalabad showing bin Laden with one of the hijackers discussing operational matters, was it clear that he at least knew about the plan. Bin Laden officially claimed responsibility on October 30th, 2004, acknowledging that Al-Qaeda had planned and executed the attacks and taking responsibility for the 19 men. By then, most everyone already suspected Al-Qaeda, and bin Laden's later statement was the formal confirmation. Why did bin Laden initially deny responsibility? There are various theories. One is that he was frightened of the repercussions. I find that unlikely. Another, more plausible idea is that the denial bought time for conspirators and accomplices. For example, the 20th man who did not board, Zacharias Moussaoui, had been arrested in August 2001 for an expired visa. Moussaoui later cooperated and confirmed involvement in the preparations. Bin Laden may have delayed admitting responsibility to allow certain people associated with the plot to flee. Who is Osama bin Laden? Osama bin Laden came from one of Saudi Arabia's wealthiest families. His father, Mohammed bin Laden, was a major construction magnate who amassed enormous wealth and close ties to the Saudi royal family. Osama received a good education, studying first in Saudi Arabia, then in London. He was deeply affected by the siege of Mecca in the 1970s, a trauma that contributed to his radicalization. In 1979, bin Laden went to Afghanistan to join the Mujahideen fighting Soviet forces. The CIA's Operation Cyclone supplied money, arms, and trainers to these fighters, and bin Laden became prominent. In 1988, he founded Al-Qaeda. After the Soviets withdrew, he returned to Saudi Arabia as a hero. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990 and U.S. troops were invited into Saudi territory, bin Laden criticized his own government for allowing foreign troops in the Holy Land. He fell out with the Saudi regime and left for Sudan, where he continued business and acquired further resources through construction and other shady dealings. He eventually fled Sudan under international pressure and relocated to Afghanistan under the protection of Mullah Omar and the Taliban, where he planned operations against the United States. By the mid-1990s, figures like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, head of Al-Qaeda's military wing, were devising increasingly audacious, media-oriented attacks. In 1993, a truck bomb detonated in the underground garage of the World Trade Center, partially collapsing floors, but not destroying the towers. That plot was an early experimentation in mass casualty terrorism. In 1996 and 1998, bin Laden and his circle issued fatwas denouncing the West and promising to move the theater of jihad to U.S. soil. Subsequent attacks, the embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998, the bombing of the USS Cole in 2000, were pieces of a single chain of escalating operations. The Millennium attacks planned by bin Laden, targeting Disneyland, towers, and other U.S. infrastructure, did not come to pass, but the pattern was clear. How the attack was prepared in the U.S. preparation took time. Some members of the so-called Hamburg Cell, including Mohammed Atta, moved to the U.S. in January 2000, about 20 months before 9/11, sent letters to flight schools, and eventually gained admission to pilot training. The training and logistical preparation consumed a year and 8 months. Funds came from somewhere to finance training and living expenses. A second group, the operatives whose role was to subdue passengers rather than fly, arrived later, roughly 6 or 7 months before the attacks. That group has been called the Malaysian Cell because in 2000, Al-Qaeda operatives met in Kuala Lumpur to discuss financing and logistics. Local intelligence observed them and reported to the FBI, but those leads did not lead to arrests. In 1998, an FBI informant, Alex station-associated personnel, warned that large numbers of Arabs were seeking access to flight schools. One such individual was Hani Hanjour, the trained pilot who flew the plane into the Pentagon. He had experience, but could not find employment with Middle Eastern carriers and trained in the U.S. The FBI had informants and warnings, but the agency's response was criticized as inadequate. There are two main explanations why some of these men were allowed into the United States: bureaucratic incompetence and an investigative strategy that hoped to monitor them rather than arrest them immediately and roll up the entire cell. That plan failed. Zacharias Moussaoui's arrest in August 2001 is a notable last-minute opportunity that could have exposed the plot. Had he been interrogated fully, he might have revealed the operation in time. But he was not. America's response and retribution. The nation was plunged into mourning. This was the biggest attack on U.S. soil since Pearl Harbor, and this time it happened at home, on Manhattan. The whole country was in shock. Media coverage heightened public fear with constant warnings of possible follow-up attacks. President George W. Bush, who was in Florida that morning visiting his brother the governor and attending a school reading event when the first alerts arrived, declared that terrorists would be punished and brought to justice. Because intelligence indicated that bin Laden was in Afghanistan under Taliban protection, the first theatrical act of retribution was directed at the Taliban regime. On October 7th, U.S. forces began operations in Afghanistan, which initially seemed successful. The Taliban were toppled, and many al-Qaeda operatives scattered. But bin Laden escaped. The U.S. military presence in Afghanistan would last until 2021, 20 years, a length of engagement no one then anticipated. Iraq in 2003 became the next major theater of action. Why Iraq? The public justification was that Saddam Hussein supported terrorism and possessed weapons of mass destruction. Secretary of State Colin Powell famously presented a vial and argued the evidence. The public accepted it. The 2003 invasion toppled Saddam's regime, but no weapons of mass destruction were found. Powell would later acknowledge the intelligence failures. Iraq devolved into a prolonged insurgency and ultimately became, for many, America's Vietnam. The occupation spawned scandals, allegations of profiteering by American firms, and deep divisions at home. Media and political aftermath, conspiracy and critique. The documentary filmmaker Michael Moore later produced Fahrenheit 9/11, arguing that the Bush administration bore political responsibility for failures before and after 9/11, and questioning its ties with Saudi and business interests. Moore and others pointed to several curious facts that generated scandal. Within days of the attacks, certain private jets were permitted to fly and carry 142 Saudi nationals, including members of the bin Laden family, out of the U.S. Despite a grounded airspace, the press asked why they were allowed to leave without interrogation, while bin Laden and others were the central suspects. That question grew into investigations into the financial ties between the Bush family and Saudi investors. A Texas businessman, James Bath, was known to have had long-standing financial relationships with members of the bin Laden family and was also connected to the Bush circle. Small loans and business relationships later seemed to entangle the families and fuel suspicion. Journalists such as Craig Unger, House of Bush, House of Saud, and Steve Call, Ghost Wars, the Bin Ladens, exposed complex cross-connections between Saudi capital, U.S. investment firms like Carlyle, and political elites. These findings fed conspiracy narratives and earned Fahrenheit 9/11 both praise and condemnation. Moore's film won the Palme d'Or in Cannes. U.S. intelligence tapes, intercepted communications, and documents uncovered in al-Qaeda safe houses in Europe and elsewhere later showed that some of the hijackers had traveled to Spain and met al-Qaeda contacts. Whether they received operational instructions or funding, there remains unclear. One concrete outcome was sweeping changes to domestic policy. Financial flows were watched much more closely, account opening and identification measures were tightened, and the 2002 USA Patriot Act granted intelligence and law enforcement agencies expanded surveillance powers, access to phone records, medical records, and correspondence. A legal framework that profoundly reduced privacy protections and launched a long public debate. A long National Commission investigation traced participants and conspirators, and the CIA's internal reviews admitted shortcomings. 2 al-Qaeda operatives known from Kuala Lumpur had been seen but not detained. The agency acknowledged missed opportunities to interdict the plot. Conspiracy theories and reality. Many conspiracy theories arose that the towers were demolished by pre-planted explosives rather than collapsing from impact and fire, that the purchase and insurance of the towers prior to the attacks was suspicious, that the Pentagon strike could not have been a Boeing because the hole was too clean. All these claims have been rebutted by structural engineers, aviation experts, and independent investigations, but conspiracy thinking thrived. Still, the overwhelming body of evidence supports the reality that Al-Qaeda executed the attacks. The story of John O'Neill is particularly bitter. An FBI counterterrorism expert obsessed with Al-Qaeda and warning of a major attack, he fell out with colleagues, was removed from key positions, and eventually resigned in frustration. O'Neill then took a job as head of security at the World Trade Center. On September 11th, he went into the building to help evacuate people and was killed in the collapse. The irony is cruel. The man who had sounded the alarm became a victim. Consequences: capture and death of perpetrators. 3,000 people were killed. The attacks changed everything: media, domestic policy, foreign policy, and financial oversight. Bin Laden would remain at large for another decade until U.S. forces found and killed him in Pakistan in 2011. His remains were scattered at sea to deny any shrine. Key Al-Qaeda lieutenants, such as Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, were captured and detained, many sent to Guantanamo Bay, and have been subjects of long interrogations and trials. Ayman al-Zawahiri, bin Laden's later successor, was also killed by a precision strike. America remained embroiled for years. Afghanistan became the longest war in U.S. history. Iraq's invasion and occupation produced prolonged violence and controversy, with reconstruction contracts awarding massive work to U.S. firms like Halliburton and raising charges of cronyism, notably Dick Cheney's association with Halliburton. Negotiations over Central Asian pipelines in the late 1990s, gas routes across Afghanistan to Pakistan, also intersected with geopolitics, with proposed Western energy deals and local politics overlapping with security concerns. No weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq. The vial Colin Powell brandished remained emblematic of the intelligence failure. But 3,000 lives could not be restored, and countless families continue to grieve. At the World Trade Center site today stands a memorial, a sober, elegant place of mourning. Names carved around the pools where the towers once stood. It is less a monument of triumph than a reminder of the destructive potential of human fanaticism. Final reflections. The attacks of 9/11 were the catastrophic realization of the violent imagination of an extremist circle, Osama bin Laden and his inner cohort, who believed they were striking back at American policies in the Islamic world. That interpretation is accepted by most analysts. But as Michael Scheuer, former head of a CIA unit tracking bin Laden, noted, "We were attacked because of what we did in the Islamic world, not because of what we believed." In other words, strategic actions by states and corporate interests intersect with religious and cultural grievances. Geopolitics breeds violent backlash. I don't mean to say the United States was purely to blame. It isn't that simple. But one cannot ignore the chain reaction that follows interventions, competing interests, and the incursions of state and corporate power into other societies. Terrorist violence remains a complicated, tragic byproduct of these global interactions. We have not found a definitive recipe for combating terrorism. Most attacks are discovered and understood only after they occur, and retribution often follows too late.